Hello, in this process video, I thought I would show you the techniques I used to make this little painting of a village in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. I found this in a Facebook group for photo references for artists and thought I would give it a try. So I'm Diane Mulligan. I am an artist, teacher, and writer. And I'm very new to YouTube, so I'm sure I'll make a lot of mistakes, and I hope you will forgive me and stay along for the ride. For this painting, what I'm trying to do is use the direct watercolor method, which is where you paint directly without any pencil drawing to get you started. So you can see my photo reference down there in the bottom, and you can see I've already made a rather comical mistake, which is I have painted an extra hill on the left. The reason I did that is I was using as my photo reference this black and white version that I edited in GridPainter on my phone. The reason I was using a black and white version was to help me focus on big shapes and not get all lost in the details for my direct watercolor, which did work. I didn't get caught up in the details. However, I misinterpreted the dark clouds that you could see at the left. I misinterpreted that as a hill. So this is now an entirely imaginary landscape and not one that exists in Scotland. But that's okay. It was a lot of fun to paint. As I'm working through the painting, I'm trying really hard to think about big shapes. And this reference is actually full of tiny details, so this was a big challenge for me. But the big shapes were, of course, the background hill and sky, and then what stood out to me as another big shape were the roofs and basic shape of the houses. I've been trying to think a lot in my painting about composition structures. So for this painting, I cropped the photo reference and tried to set up a sort of fulcrum composition where I have a bunch of big shapes on one side balanced by a small shape on the other. And what I was working with here were my houses on the one side are a big shape, and there's a small like dinghy that I'll draw in on the other side as the balancing shape. So I don't know if it totally worked, but that was my aim. The other big challenge I had with this photo reference, it's not a very high contrast reference, and I know that the best images are going to come with strong shadows and lights and darks, which I didn't really have here, but I decided instead of focusing on shadow shapes to just focus on that compositional balance. You may have noticed there one of my mistakes as a new to YouTube artist. I turned my watercolor block for my convenience. Obviously, that makes for slight visual confusion here in the recording. I did try to mitigate it by zooming in for you, so hopefully that wasn't too weird. I make that mistake a few times in this video, so again, thanks for your patience. I am new at this. All right, what you can see now is I am drawing in the important shapes using a watercolor pencil. The reason I'm using watercolor pencil is you can't really erase it. You can sort of smudge it out with water, but once you put down those lines, you pretty much have to live with them. And I have found that I get a little too tight and anxious when using a regular pencil, that I want to get all the lines perfect. I'm constantly erasing, and the end result is a painting that is really, it feels really tight and controlled. Since I'm trying to move away from that tight and controlled vibe, I found that things I can't erase help me a lot. I just want to pause to mention here that this playback is sped up, so this is much faster than I was actually working. It's slower than a time lapse, which is one of the things I'm really liking about YouTube as opposed to, say, Instagram Reels, is that I can have a lot more control over the speed and fit in all my content. But this is, I think this portion I sped up about 3 times the actual speed, where I'm just drawing in the lines. And you can see that I'm not doing a very detailed drawing. I'm just aiming for the big shapes and giving myself some more clues and directional lines so that when I start adding more details in watercolor, I know where I'm going and I don't get lost. I have put my reference back up so you can see what it is I'm drawing. And I'm, again, working from the black and white. I really didn't have a lot of detail that I could put in. And I also had some areas of confusion where I really wasn't sure what I was looking at, and I had to just make my best guess at it. Okay, so now the next portion of the video, in real time, this took me about 45 minutes to do the next step of the layer of painting. And as I'm, again, trying to work from some of the big shapes, and I'm also focusing at this moment on getting some of the darks in. In watercolor, we generally do work from light to dark because it's a transparent medium and you can't cover things up once they're really dark. However, I find when I have some really clear definitive darks that I know need to be in place, it's really helpful for me to get those in relatively early to anchor everything. So the roofs are obviously very dark, and I wanted to put those in quickly. A little note about some of the supplies that I'm using here. This is a watercolor block by Field. To be totally honest, I really don't like this watercolor paper at all. I think it performs very poorly. Even though it's 100% cotton, I just don't get my preferred results with it. And so I'm actually trying to use up this block by playing with some new techniques, such as this technique where I paint before I draw. I don't have to feel bad about feeling like I'm ruining a good sheet of paper if it goes very badly, because I don't really like this paper, and I won't be buying it again. But I do like my other supplies quite a bit. Most of the paints that I'm using here are the Daniel Smith Primatek paints. I'm quite new to the Primatek paints, but what I love about them is they are really granulating. So they make a lot of interesting texture just by the way they work. The green in the background is the Primatek Serpentine Genuine. The colors I used on the roof, you kind of saw the watercolor stick flash into the video for a minute there in my hand. Those are watercolor sticks that come, they look like a pastel or something, but they're watercolor. And I was using the Primatek Piemontite Genuine, Soladite Genuine, I might be saying these wrong, and Hematite, which are colors that work really beautifully for that like stone texture. And those are the colors you're seeing me drop in right there on the rocky shore, and that darker area where the water meets the rocky beach. I'm also using some Caran D'Ache watercolor pencils. These are from the Museum Aquarelle line. Now I'm heading into what I feel was my biggest mistake in this painting, and that is I start painting in every stone on this house in the foreground. Here's my reference to show you that the house is pretty prominent, and even in the black and white you can see a lot of the individual stones. However, I think in the painting it's kind of distracting, and if I were to do this one again, I would not paint every stone. Okay, the segment I'm painting in now was one of my biggest points of confusion in the reference. Initially, I didn't realize there was a wall in there. So There are definitely some things in my drawing that are not quite accurate, but that's okay. This was really all about the practice, and I'm not trying to say I know exactly what it feels like to stand on this beach. I have never been to this beach, but I'm just trying to convey this overall vibe. I do usually try as much as possible to paint from life. If I can't paint from life and direct observation, then I try to use my own photo references. But every now and then, feels like my bucket of photo references is empty and I need a little bit of help, which is why I love the Facebook group Landscape References for Artists, because people share photos that they are willing to let anybody reproduce and use. Even if you plan to sell your art, you're allowed to use them, which is very cool. For a lot of juried exhibits, you are not actually allowed to submit work where you've used someone else's reference. But if you're just painting for practice and you're just working on your own thing, then I think it can be really useful. However, if I knew this location better, I wouldn't have accidentally put a hill on the left, and that would probably be a more sensible painting. So now as I'm getting into these little details, things like adjusting color, there was one house there that was kind of peach, and just giving a little bit of variety, try to create more visual interest in the row of houses. And here, giving some texture. I felt that I was really struggling with the foreground beach. I sometimes have a hard time with foregrounds and getting the right level of detail there, either going way too detailed or not enough. But for this beach, I decided I really want to just focus on kind of convey some of that rocky texture and just making it something that brings your eye up into the scene and not something that is at all a focal point. That said, as you can see here, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get the right level of texture and the right value. I didn't want to make it too dark because there's a lot of other darks in this scene, but if it's too light, then it's too distracting. I have really been loving using my watercolor pencils in addition to paints. And here I'm bringing in, I feel like I'm getting close to the end final details, so I'm bringing in an acrylic marker to bring back some whites where I lost them by doing that first layer of paint. I have to admit, I see other people use these Posca pens and they get amazing coverage and they can really get an opaque white. I don't know if I'm using them wrong or what, but I do not tend to get as good results as other people do. They are useful though. Probably for a really opaque white, my better bet would be gouache, but I forget to go grab my tube of gouache. You can see there, that was the only ink I used on this whole thing, was a banister on that staircase, which in my initial drawing, I had no idea there was a staircase there. It was only when I went back to looking at the color photo, I realized that that was actually what was happening in my foreground house. And here I am, real finishing touches. That was a little bit of Neocolor, which is like a oil pastel crayon. And really trying to refine the water. I have a very hard time painting water. So trying to get the right value and some little shape and movement in the water. I don't know, now looking at the finished painting, if I ended up maybe going too dark on my foreground beach and everything got a little bit samey, but I really was struggling with getting the tone in there that made the most sense. Just those tiny last little fiddly details that you can spend a really long time on, and trying to add a bit more depth and contrast. I really definitely struggled with a lack of contrast in this painting. I think it still could use more. And after I had taken a pause, I came back and thought, given the detailed stonework on that foreground house. My 2 stone walls needed a bit more detail as well, so I came back in with another watercolor pencil. The paper was still damp, so I got a pretty good variety of marks from the watercolor pencil. And truly the last details here, just some final textures and final depth. And the last thing I did, I came back with a white watercolor pencil and just tried to decrease the brightness of the stones on that house that's bothering me. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you'll try some of these techniques. Bye.